Hello.
All right. Welcome everyone to the Drawing Lab Live. Today we're going to be focusing on seed pods. And so before we get started, I wanted to just make a few quick announcements, check in with everybody. So with me, as always, is my wife and business partner, Sarah Faye. She is going to be fielding your questions today. So this is, of course, a live drawing demonstration. At any point, if you have a question about what it is we're doing, what we're working on, why, the process, please feel free to ask. And one of the things that makes these lives really worth doing is a lot of interaction with you viewers. So I love questions. I want your questions. Without your participation, this might as well be an asynchronous drawing demo. So I really encourage you to get involved, ask questions. And for those of you who have been with me for a number of lives, I always like to keep the questions focused on what we're doing today. So just to make sure that we're not getting really wild questions. That being said, it occurs to me that with Sarah Faye here, if we have some downtime, maybe you want to ask her what it's like to live and work with a creative type. So she might have some interesting perspectives there for those of you who are interested in the more business end of the creative world. So a few quick announcements while we're waiting for people to come in. So as you know, I'm going to be doing a drawing demo of seed pods today. And all of the techniques that I'm using in this demo are really spelled out in deep and strategic ways in my drawing lab courses. So in these drawing demos, what I'm doing is I am putting into action all of the fundamental skills that I teach in my drawing lab courses. And you are encouraged to follow along, but if you ever feel like you need some additional practice of the fundamentals, I highly recommend checking those out. Go to BrentEviston.com where you'll find all of my courses, the drawing lab, figure drawing courses, creativity courses. But of course, I want to make sure that we continue to do these live streams. So if enrolling in a course just isn't in reach for you, that you're still getting a really solid foundation in drawing. It is my goal, it is my passion to be able to share my love of drawing with all of you. And so, whether you can enroll in a course or not, I want to make sure that I'm sharing my love of drawing because it really is an incredible and profound process. So, Sarah Faye, before I get started, do you have any announcements that you'd like to make or anything you'd like to share?
Hi. Well, I just wanted to remind folks that we have a reference photo of the seed pod that Brent will be doing a longer demo of today. And if you haven't had a chance to download that yet, you can go to the description for this video, and there's a link. You can also scroll up in the comments, and there's a link. It's one of the first comments in the chat. And if you've previously signed up to access the reference photos for Brent's YouTube channel, then all you need to do is go to BrentEviston.com and log in, and you'll have access right there. You don't need to sign up each time. But if it's your first time, please sign up so that you get added to that collection of reference photos. And as Brent said, please post any comments or clarifications that you have in the chat, and I'd love to bring those to Brent throughout our live stream.
Yes, or questions.
Yes.
Yeah, so before we get right into the longer drawing demonstration, I want to talk about why seed pods for a few minutes, and then I'm going to do a quick warm-up. We're going to do some quick sketches. So one of the most popular drawing subjects are botanicals. And when we think of botanicals, we often think about leaves, flowers, sometimes trees or full plants. And those are all wonderful to draw. They're beautiful subjects. However, when looking into botanicals, I completely fell in love with seed pods. Seed pods, I feel like, are often overlooked or the unsung heroes of the botanical world. they often get overshadowed by flowers or leaves. But seed pods are absolutely incredible. So I have a large collection of different kinds of seed pods. This is just a small portion of my collection. Many of these I found on walks. For the more exotic seed pods, I find that Etsy is a fantastic place to go to order them. But I just wanted to share a few of them. Now, full disclosure, I'm not a botanist, I'm not a scientist. I don't know all of the scientific names for all of these. And for many of these, I don't even know their common names. So I'm going to just share them as beautiful and interesting forms. But all of these are various kinds of seed pods, mostly for trees. And in terms of drawing, their forms are just absolutely incredible. And one thing I want you to note here is just the wide variation of different kinds of shapes and forms. This one almost looks like the skin of a dried piece of fruit. This one, I'm not quite sure what you think this looks like. It almost looks quite alien. It's very dried out, and this one's very fragile. This one's kind of like a piece of wood. It's pretty indestructible, but this one feels much more like paper. It's very fragile. You can see it still has a few seeds inside of it. Also, the variation in sizes are pretty incredible. So, these are, of course, large seed pods, but we can also find much smaller seed pods. So seed pods that many people are familiar with are things like acorns. Pine cones, of course, are seeds. And near the end of this this demo, we'll look into some drawings that I've done, including a pine cone. So here we have a very conical shaped seed pod that has this opening in the middle. I believe, is this an anise seed pod, a star anise? Is that what this is? No, probably not. One of my very favorite seed pods, this one is known as the Devil's Claw seed pod. I just think this one is so gestural and beautiful. I have a whole collection of different kinds of these seed pods. And again, I think they're very strange and alien looking, but they're so beautiful. I keep this one in its case. I don't know how well you can see this. I have a little glass jar. This one is very sharp and very spiky and very difficult to pick up without poking yourself. But again, just these incredible forms. They're gestural, they're structural, they're sculptural. They're such beautiful forms. So I just wanted to share some of these with you. I am currently working on a botanical drawing video that will focus on some of these forms, actually. There's gonna be a free version releasing on YouTube and a more in-depth version that I think is gonna be part of the drawing lab. So anyway, I just wanted to share some of these seed pods with you. If any of you know the names of these or what they're actually seed pods for, I'd be fascinated to know in the comments. Again, I'm coming at this from an artistic perspective, not necessarily a scientific perspective where I know the names and where they're from. But in terms of connecting with objects, as I often say, one of my favorite parts about drawing is that it allows us to really connect with nature or any subject we want to in a very deep way. So these are the seed pods we're going to be focusing on today. The common names are, you often hear things like bat pods because these look like bats. Sometimes they're called bull's head pods. Seraphe, did you figure out the scientific name? I know you were looking into that. Seraphe, are you?
Yes, we do have some of the scientific names, but I certainly don't know how to pronounce the scientific name. It is listed in the description for the course. I do have a couple of the links to the Etsy places where Brent got these or some of these seed pods. And yeah, it's a really long word that starts with a P, but that's about
you want to give it a try?
Oh, proboscidea?
Proboscidea, okay.
Yeah.
All right. So one thing you might note is I'm brushing off my paper, and that is because these are real natural objects. So it's got dust and detritus on the drawing. So that's very typical. If you're ever bringing in actual natural objects into your studio, you do want to note that. In fact, I've known people who collect birds' nests, and they often have to deal with insects and all kinds of other things in the studio. Another thing that's great about drawing seed pods is that they don't decay. So a lot of botanicals. So I've done a lot of demos of flowers. When you bring flowers into the studio under a hot light, they start to wilt, they start to decay, and seed pods don't do that. They will be in this state. Many of these seed pods I've had for years, and they look exactly the same as when I got them. So that's another reason they're great. So my hope is that I'm introducing you to a new and beautiful form of drawing here. So before we get started with our longer demo, I wanted to do just a few quick sketches of some different kinds of seed pods, and just to get out some ideas here. Now, a quick note. I am looking at these seed pods from a very different perspective than what the camera is seeing. So what I'm going to sketch out here is going to look different from what's on my drawing board. But I did just want to start off. So just a few quick warm-ups. You're welcome to draw along with me from what you see here. But when we first start off, we want to capture just the basic forms. And as always, we want to start off with the largest form. So the largest form of this seed pod is this ovoidal shape here. I'm drawing this a little bit bigger than the actual seed pod. And this ovoidal shape is going to narrow down into almost a needle-like form. And we have this sort of needle-shaped cone at the bottom here. But so once I've got this larger simplified form worked out, I'm going to draw these large curving, I don't know what you call these. I think I've referred to them as tendrils, but I'm sure they have a much more scientific name. And again, if we have any botanists in the crowd, let me know. But as always, I'm starting off with these incredibly light, soft lines. I'm not drawing any details. I'm capturing shapes. And with these linear forms, I'm capturing their direction. And again, we're doing this before we add any detail or anything else. So once I have these basic forms worked out, I can go in and start to add a little more detail. So I can divide this ovoidal form. See, it's kind of got a seam running up, and out of that seam, we have these, again, really strange kind of textural. I mean, I guess to me, it almost looks like a mohawk sticking out of the center of this thing. And again, these are just quick warm-up sketches to get us started here. And after that, we could start to, add some texture to the contours to get this to look a little more like what we're seeing. We draw these sharper needle-like forms of these tendrils. Seraph, do we have any notable questions or comments?
We have some questions about the specifics of the seed pods. Marilyn also collects seed pods on her walks, but I know we've kind of maxed out our knowledge of what these seed pods are that you have.
Yeah. I think this kind of falls into the very kind of cliched artist category. Like, I'm so taken with the form, and I want to experience the form. That I often forget to check in with what kinds of plants that they grow, or their their name beyond the common names. But yeah, Marilyn, do you have any favorites from your collection? I'd love to hear about that, or any suggestions for my collection that are not represented here. So another quick warm up. I'm going to actually draw one of these bat pods that we're going to be working with in a larger demo today. Now, one of the first things I want to get a sense of is how the width to height relationship here. So if we imagine a box around this, I think it's going to be about twice as wide as it is high. So that's just something that I want to think about while drawing. So I'm going to break this form down. We have this large triangular form in the center. We have this sort of scooped out form here, and then we have these cone-shaped forms that are extending out toward either side. And again, it really does look like a bat. I didn't think about this specifically, but I suppose this is thematic with it being October now. Now, one thing that I always like to keep in mind when drawing subjects like seed pods is that there's a thing in drawing called margin of error. And what margin of error refers to is how inaccurate you can be while still having a good drawing. And with natural objects, we have a much larger margin of error than we do with, say, something like the human figure, right? So in the human figure, if you make an arm too long or a foot too small or an eye too big, people who have never drawn in their life immediately pick up on this, and they can identify it as a mistake, as an error. However, with seed pods, we have a lot more freedom because the variation in these is so wide. So I'm not giving you permission to draw in a sloppy way, but how I like to use margin of error is, if I see something that's curved in a dramatic way, I'll often curve it a little more than I can see just for dramatic effect, or I'll emphasize things. I want you to take a look at, just these two pods here. You can see that they're related, but their shapes are totally different, right? This one on the left is taller. This one on the right is shorter and wider. You can see that their tendrils are going in different directions. So this just gives us some freedom to exaggerate a little bit, to add some drama without worrying about perfect accuracy, because it's always going to be plausible that the exaggerated drawing is just, that there may be a seed pod out there in the world with those exact characteristics. Okay, so we've done a couple quick warm-ups. I've introduced you to seed pods. So now we're going to get to the longer demonstration. So
Brent, can I ask about your camera over the drawing board?
Oh, sure.
I know that we had looked at one point on whether it could be zoomed in at all. Is this as zoomed in as it can be?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Well, so this is the drawing we're going to be working with. You can see that I have laid out the basic shape of this bat pod already. So if you haven't done so already, I'd like you just to make sure that you have your reference photo if you're going to be drawing along with us. So I'm working from the reference photo that's available on the side. The reason usually I draw these from life, but of course, when we're working with a reference photo, we can make sure that we're all drawing the same subject from the same point of view. So I want to take you through what I've done so far. So I just blocked in the basics of the subject. Again, you can see this triangular form, this larger triangular form here. We have these wings of the bat pod that are extending outward. And we also have this kind of interesting shape in the middle. And this particular seed pod, I actually measured quite a bit. So the width to height was about if we look at the height as 1 unit, it takes about 2 1/3 of the height to go across the width. Now, you don't have to get this exact for this seed pod. Again, we do have a lot of margin of error, but it's just, something I wanted to address. With oddly shaped objects like this, where the width to height ratio does seem to matter, this is just a way we can think about this to get the proper proportions or get them close enough for this kind of drawing. So I assume, Sarah Faye, you feel like this drawing is big enough for our purposes here?
Yes, this one people can see much better.
Yeah.
And if you'd like, as you're getting started, to talk about pencils, Beth asks what pencil hardness you were using for those early sketches. She has a heavy hand, so her sketches are darker than she likes.
Yeah, so my style of drawing, I don't use graphite pencils. I'm actually using oil-based colored pencils, and I don't use them in different forms of hardness or softness. I modify value based on pressure. So really quickly, I did just want to show you. Yeah, so these are oil-based colored pencils. I know a lot of people are familiar with like Prismacolor pencils. Those are wax-based, so they don't get quite as dark. They're not as creamy, and they tend to get this sort of waxy bloom over time that can diminish some of the darks. But these oil-based colored pencils go dark, and they're very pressure sensitive. So in addition to making very dark lines, I can also make these incredibly light lines just by changing the pressure. So now this just comes down to preference, Beth. I don't like to feel like I have to switch pencils every time I want a different value. So I've trained my mind and hand to, just modify pressure. Beth, I'm not sure where you are in your drawing process, but I use I think in a 5-step value scale, with number 5 being the darkest value, number 1 being the lightest value. And so I've kind of trained my hand to be able to say, if I want a number 3 value, to just draw at a number 3 value, right? If I need a number 2 value, I can just draw at a number 2 value. So I practiced this quite a bit. And of course, 5 is, the hardest you can push. But hopefully, you can kind of see like the kind of pencil that I use, how I think through using these kinds of pencils. And I love these kinds of pencils. I think they work great. So that's what I'm using. And again, it's just modifying the pressure of the pencil. So I'm going to be using the exact same pencil throughout this entire demonstration. So with the basic shapes worked out, now I'm going to go around and start solidifying the contour. So you'll notice that my lines are getting darker, but not terribly dark yet. I want to save my really dark lines for a little later on in the drawing. So one thing I want you to note when I'm working on this kind of drawing here is that I am not drawing slowly. So when I'm making these kinds of, you might call them arabesque lines, they're made with some speed. And I find that, drawing these kinds of lines too slowly starts to limit their beauty. I don't know. I kind of like my lines to appear as if they are careening around the edges of the form, almost out of control. Now, in a demo like this, I will admit I do tend to, when I'm drawing live on camera, I do tend to slow down a little more than if I'm drawing on my own. But hopefully you can still get a sense of the speed at which I'm drawing these lines. They're not all slow, careful lines. I like them to appear gestural. I like them to appear a little wild. So another quick note here on this subject. When we're dealing with organic forms, they are often asymmetrical. So from one point of view, we could say this is a symmetric object. But if we start to look at the specifics, we note that, let's say, the sort of tip right here is off a little to the left. And if we draw a line down to the apex of this opening here, it's tilted. And then it changes direction and goes the other way. So, the center here is actually a little slanted or curved, which is interesting. So I really love crafting these kinds of contours. I feel like they end up being really beautiful and sumptuous. And I'm often just slightly exaggerating some of the bulbous qualities of these. And you'll note that I'm always working from, not always, I'm trying to keep in mind to work from the larger forms down to the smaller forms.
Brent, can I interject a question?
Oh, sure.
What's the best way to train line confidence when drawing organic forms like seed pods?
Yeah, so, well, I think that, let me pull my extra paper over again. So one of the greatest myths in drawing is that drawing happens slowly. And it's so common where I see students trying to work at a contour, and it's like they're just clinging on to an edge for dear life as they very slowly try and work their way around. I think this happens from like blind contour exercises. And so in my experience, the slower you go and the less variation you have, the less interesting the drawing is. And I think about this, my go-to metaphor for line quality is always tone of voice. You want to think about your lines the same way you think about tone of voice. If I came on this live stream and I just talked in a very slow and monotone way without ever making my voice louder or faster or quieter or slower, it would be a pretty boring experience. So instead, I really like to make sure that there are parts where I'm much more animated. There are parts where I'm concentrating, but there's a constant shift and change. We want the same thing for your line quality. So, I want you to know something. So I'm going to draw a curved line slowly here first. Now, when you draw slowly, you'll note that this is actually a harder way to draw a straight line or an even line. You get all of these little like jerks in the line. I don't know how well this is reading on camera, but you can actually even see the heartbeat and it creates all these little jiggles. So now look at a line, same kind of line I'm going to draw quickly. I just think this is a much more beautiful and interesting line. It's calligraphic. It looks like it was drawn quickly, right? So I think these kinds of lines are just more engaging. They're more beautiful. They're more interesting. So, I would suggest, try just making lines abstractly just to see what kinds of lines you can create. Using the side of the pencil, you can create these very, almost smoke-like lines. If you want to use the tip of the pencil, you can create much sharper lines. But so, yeah, like try drawing quickly. And I think you'll get a sense really quickly that, the lines that are drawn with a little more speed, using the side of the pencil, so you get that much more calligraphic sense. I feel like these lines are much more beautiful and interesting to look at. So that's why in a drawing like this, I spend, I craft the contour by with these faster, more fluid lines. I think it looks more interesting. Another thing I want you to note is I did not just go around and start tracing around the edge. You'll notice that the contour is made up of separate lines, right? So, I kind of started down here and I drew this line, then we have this line, then I drew this line, then this line, then this line. So these are all separate lines that are coming together to craft this form. As I am drawing different kinds of forms, I'm also using different kinds of lines. And there's always a hierarchy to my line. You'll notice that it's very common that when I'm first drawing the initial form, I'll often draw with this very soft edged line, right? So this is softer and lighter. And as I get more confident that this is the form I want, then I can go back in and darken right over it. So this is a very consistent strategy that I tend to use is, starting off with a lighter line as I'm working out the form. Oh, and not just light, but soft, right? A softer line. For those of you who are newer to my teaching or perhaps have not yet gone through a course like the Drawing Lab, one thing I want to share is you'll note that I'm almost always using the overhand grip. So this is, the grip that most people are familiar with is the tripod grip. So this is used for writing. But this form of tripod grip engages the tip of the pencil, so you can only make one kind of line. But if we switch over to the overhand grip, so the overhand grip, if you're unfamiliar, if you place your pencil with a point facing away from you, you hold your hand over it and take your thumb and pointer finger, pick up the pencil like this and just let your fingers wrap around. This is the overhand grip. And it allows you to engage both the broad side of the pencil to make softer, thicker lines, as well as the tip if you need to. So you can make all kinds of different kinds of lines that are just simply not possible if you're only using the more traditional tripod grip. So I am always encouraging people to use the overhand grip just because it opens up so much line variation. Is that an adequate answer for the individual who asked? I hope so.
I'll let you know. I have a couple of other more general drawing fundamentals questions. So one is, what area of art and drawing should I start as an animation student?
Well, their drawing fundamentals are described as such because they are fundamental. So I don't think it necessarily matters if you want to be a Renaissance style figurative painter or you want to get into animation. Studying the basic forms first. Always start off simple and work your way up. So, the first things that I would recommend doing are, drawing basic three-dimensional forms, spheres, cylinders, cubes. Those foundational forms are what are going to make any more complex subjects really stand out. So it's always critical to remember here that all form, no matter how complex, simplifies into much more basic three-dimensional forms like spheres, cylinders, and cubes. And if you can draw those well, then you'll really be able to draw just about anything you want to. And this is one of the great secrets of drawing is those are the forms. They're it doesn't matter whether you're drawing a bird or a seed pod or a leaf, like all forms simplify down into these really basic three-dimensional forms like spheres and cylinders and cubes. So focus on drawing those first. If I were to prescribe a regimen, I would start you off with really basic things like fruits and vegetables. And the reason why you see so many drawings of like apples and pears and things like that is not because people think these objects are so beautiful. What they're doing is they're training their mind, they're working their way up. One of the worst things you can do while learning to draw is starting off with the human figure or starting off with portraiture. And those subjects are so complicated. It's like trying to do complex trigonometry before you can do addition. There's a hierarchy of forms you need to learn to draw first. There's this great quote. I think it's from Robert Beverly Hale, who was a teacher at the Art Students League, and I don't remember the exact quote, but it goes something like this. Whenever he sees a student struggling to draw the human figure, he'll pause and ask them to draw the model stand that they're on, the sort of block-shaped model stand. And what he finds is that many students who are trying to deal with the human figure, which is infinitely complex, can't draw a simple cube in reasonable perspective, right? And if you can't draw a cube in perspective, there's no way that you can draw the human form or something much more complex. So, that would be my first recommendation is, start simple, get the fundamentals down, work with things like fruit, vegetables, simple forms, apples, pears, oranges. And once you can draw and shade those, start working your way up to more complex subjects.
So I know that was an answer to a question about an animation student.
Mhm.
And while you were talking about that, Katya asked, how is the process different when drawing from imagination?
Well, so drawing from imagination is incredibly challenging. And the answer I would actually give is not that different. So in order to draw successfully from imagination, you need to be able to believably invent all of the forms that you want to draw. So essentially, you have to. My recommendation for drawing from imagination would be first to master drawing from observation, which is what we're doing here. And once you become incredibly skilled at drawing from observation, at that point you can start to invent forms out of your head. But without that foundation of observational drawing first, then drawing from imagination is incredibly difficult because again, you have to understand how all form works, right? So a good bridge if you want to think about it, if you want to draw the human body from imagination, first you have to be able to draw, let's say, just an arm from observation. And once you get practice drawing, that arm from observation in multiple different viewpoints and different positions, then try putting away the photo reference, right? So, or try doing it without a model, and then you'll really see how much you know about the human arm. Now, and again, the arm is just one part of the body, right? If you want to create creatures, creatures, whether they be in mythology or video games, they're combinations of existing forms, right? They're not invented out of nothing. And so in order to do that successfully, let's say, if you want to do a dragon, dragon's something like part snake, part alligator, part bat, part lion. Well, you have to be able to draw all of those things out of your head before you can understand how to start to combine these different elements of them. So this is my long-winded way of saying, even if you want to draw from imagination, the pathway is still mastering observational drawing first, and then shifting over to drawing from imagination. There is, I think, for people who are new to drawing, who may be struggling with the fundamentals, there's often this hope that, well, I want to draw from imagination, therefore, hopefully I can avoid. And Katya, I'm not saying this is you, but hopefully I can avoid, learning the observational drawing part. Perspective's hard. If I draw from imagination, then I can avoid learning perspective. And the reality is quite the opposite. What you find is that drawing from a reference photo, having that reference is kind of like having a cheat sheet right in front of you, right? Because all of the information is spelled out for you. You don't have to draw anything from imagination because everything is right there. So it's once you start to try to draw from imagination, you realize how drawing from observation is actually the much easier route to take. All right, so what I'm going to start doing in this drawing is I've worked out a lot of the basic forms, but I think I'm about ready to start to apply some basic light and shadow. And light and shadow is always going to be when a drawing like this starts to come to life. So a couple quick notes on light and shadow here. As you can see from the reference photo, our light is coming from the upper left. And so the upper left areas of the subject are being lit, and the lower right areas are most likely going to be in shadow. And you can really see this with the cast shadow, right? In fact, I'm going to take a moment here and block in a rough version of the cast shadow so we can see the shadow coming down and toward the right. I don't know how much I'm actually going to darken the cast shadow here, but I do at least want to just get it blocked in really quickly so we have something to, just so we know where we are in the drawing. So there's the cast shadow. One of the cool things about this reference photo, may drive you crazy eventually, but I kind of like the lost edge that the cast shadow almost blends in with the edge of the form. I think that's very beautiful and interesting. So if we get far enough, that could be a very kind of cool and dramatic effect. So whenever we deal with shading, we always want to look at the overall light and shadow patterns first. And we're always looking for the moment where a form goes from light into shadow. And so I'm going to start by drawing that division between light and shadow. So if you remember your drawing fundamentals, this is called the line of termination, where a form shifts out of the light and goes into shadow. Now, because this seed pod is kind of a complex subject, one thing you're going to see me do is I'm actually going to start to apply value as I go. One of the reasons for this is because with a complex subject, it is easy to lose sight of which lines are contours and which lines are the lines of termination. So I'm going to apply a light wash of value as I go to make sure that I'm not losing which lines are contour edges and which ones are light and shadow edges. Now, a quick note here as I am breaking down the light and shadow. I'm always trying to figure out what kinds of forms these are. And I'm always thinking about these forms in terms of 3 dimensions. So with this kind of form here, you can see I know the light's coming from the upper left. So the upper left portion is going to get light, and the lower portions and the portions over to the right are going to get more shadow. And this is going to be a simplification here as well. So I'm starting with these larger forms. Now over here, the light and shadow patterns are really fascinating because we get so much of this form is going into shadow.
Brent, Yashvi is asking, how can you tell the difference between light and reflected light?
Sure. So reflected light is always going to be part of the shadow. So it's important to understand how reflected light happens. So remember, reflected light occurs when light comes down hits the surface of the object is resting upon and bounces back up and adds some light into the shadow. So where we see reflected light most in this subject is right along this lower right edge. You can see like the darkness of the cast shadow, but right next to that cast shadow, you can still see some detail. That's light reflecting off of the surface the subject is sitting upon or in the environment, and it's adding some additional light back into those shadows. So the definitional part is that the lit areas of the subject are any part of the subject receiving light directly from the light source. But reflected light is not direct light, right? So reflected light has to be reflected off of an adjacent surface. And reflected light is also not as bright as direct light.
Oh, Brent, I'm going to share these thoughts from Marilyn, and they're related to your previous talking about the reference photo that you're working from. And she shares that she previously had a negative opinion about an artist who used reference photos to create her art. And Marilyn feels like she owes her an apology now.
Well, so yeah, let me unpack this a little bit. So there are a few things in art that are black and white. And it's important to remember, drawing is hard. It's very difficult, and it takes years to master. And it's incredibly enjoyable and a profound experience. And I always want to distinguish here too the idea between drawing for pleasure versus drawing for perfection. The reason that we all draw is because we like the way we feel when we draw, right? Like that's what it comes down to. And, drawing can be a profound way to connect with the physical world around us. And as such, I do think that drawing from life whenever possible is the best way to go. But there are some exceptions to this rule. So one of them, as you recall, these seed pods are very small. And so it makes a lot of sense to be able to photograph a seed pod like this and blow it up so we can see a lot more of the detail and texture, right? Now you'll note that I have these seed pods on hand. This is actually something I do pretty frequently, right? Go back and forth. So if I have a question about the three-dimensionality, like, well, what is this shape? It can be hard to tell in a two-dimensional photograph. Then I can actually pick up the object and see, right? I can experience it firsthand. I can see what it feels like. And that can inform the drawing that I'm working on firsthand here. Also with figure drawing, many of the poses that I like to draw from are extremely difficult to hold. And, I like poses that have, lunges or raised arms or, poses that look like they might be at home in a ballet. And so when we're drawing those kinds of poses, you can't hold them for more than 2 minutes, but a finished figure drawing can take hours to create. So what do we do there? Well, that's a great time for photo reference. So, I draw from life a lot. I work from actual models on a really regular basis. But most of the figure drawings that if you've seen any of the figure drawings that I've done that you're familiar with, they were probably done from reference photos from a purely practical perspective because it's very difficult to draw. It's very difficult to hold those poses, and so drawing them from life is the only way. Drawing them from a reference photo is the only way to really capture that kind of pose in an extended drawing. So it really depends on what you're doing, and I wouldn't be rigid about a lot of the rules here. So hopefully that kind of sums up my thoughts here. That yes, drawing from life typically is better than drawing from reference photos. However, there are many good reasons to draw from reference photos. Any other, was that a reasonable answer to that question?
I think that was a reasonable answer, yes. Let's see. Another more general question is about Procreate. Can you talk a little bit about what you think of the difference between drawing with Procreate versus pencil and paper?
Sure. So we have some time. I'll give a bit of a roundabout answer here. So for anybody who uses Photoshop, you are likely aware that Photoshop, the tools are based mostly on darkroom tools. Tools that you actually used in an old school darkroom with an enlarger. The whole terminology of dodging and burning, cropping. Like these are all things done with an enlarger. And if you've never had the experience of doing that, then the names and functions of the tools can often be difficult to understand. Now, I was fortunate enough to have a dark room in my high school, and shortly after I left high school, that dark room was it was taken down and used for something else because digital was up and coming. Similarly, in the college I attended, the dark room there, I was the last year of being able to use that dark room, and after I finished out that year, that dark room too was disassembled, taken apart, and used for something else. But I always am so glad I got that experience, because now I know why all of these terminologies are used when I use something like Photoshop. I understand what dodging and burning is because I've actually used a piece of paper on a wire to dodge an area in an actual photograph to lighten it, right? Or the opposite. I've used used ways to obscure most of the photograph, but have a hole through which the light can go to burn in an area. Once you do it by hand, it makes perfect sense why all these tools work the way they do in Photoshop. So this is my very long-winded way of saying, Procreate and digital drawing programs like it are trying to replicate the experience of drawing or painting on paper or canvas. And so, I think it's great if you're interested in digital to work back and forth on both. There's something that's really wonderful about real paper and understanding, the look and feel that's going to create that you don't get from the smooth surface of the screen. In fact, there are even devices at this point that you can purchase to get your screen to feel more like paper. But yeah, I think it's worth, if you're interested in digital, working back and forth from both, so you can understand what the original idea is behind that they're trying to replicate. There's no reason that you can't have that firsthand experience. And then figuring out, how you want to, why you want to use digital instead. There are a lot of benefits to digital format. You don't have all of the paper use. Buying endless paper can be expensive. The sheet of paper I'm currently drawing on costs over $3 a sheet, which doesn't sound like a lot until you realize how many drawings I'm doing in a month. And then you can think about the cost of the paper cost to do that. If I'm doing 50 drawings in a month, well, that ends up being quite a bit of money, right? So, with digital, you just have, endless amounts of surfaces to draw on, which can be very nice. But yeah, I think working back and forth from both is a really great way to go.
So Brent, Beth asks or says that she sees you moving around to different parts of the drawing. Is there a
Yes.
path that you're following? Is it light to dark values, personal preference?
Yeah, so let me unpack this a little bit. So when I'm drawing, uh, when I'm drawing in a demo and answering questions, I will admit it's easy to get a little distracted. And so it kind of splits my brain a little bit. And so I do tend to draw in a little more of a haphazard way than I would if I were just doing a straight drawing demo. So generally speaking, I am, working at different parts of the drawing, breaking down the light and shadow patterns overall. And you can see those broad light and shadow patterns, but there is also a little bit of shifting around as my brain is shifting around to different parts. So, but generally speaking, I'm working big to small. So I'm working on the bigger forms first. And so you can see I started off with, these light and shadow patterns here. Then I went down to these light and shadow patterns on these forms. And now I'm starting to break down the light and shadow patterns on these smaller forms. So generally speaking, I'm working from the biggest forms first and working my way down to the smaller forms. This is why, if you'll notice, like some of the smallest light and shadow patterns are on these forms up here. Each one of these is like a little cylinder. None of those are shaded in yet because they're some of the smallest forms there. Also, I'm looking over to my computer screen so I can kind of get a sense of what you students are seeing. And I am trying to make sure the drawing is evolving in a way that reads well for the camera. So yeah, so generally big to small with admittedly some minor distraction and getting a little unfocused and shifting around as I answer student questions. So let me, I was just thinking about this. I've been working on some horse drawings lately. And one thing that I found I found myself doing with the horse drawings, horses are a new subject for me. And I was aware that, I do shift around to different parts of the drawing as I draw. And I was thinking to myself as I was drawing that, I would not recommend students to draw like this. And there is a big difference between how I draw when I'm working on a drawing personally versus when I'm working on a demo for students. And when I teach, if you were taking a drawing lab course, then I go through this really specific process, basic shapes first, then I break down the contours in a descriptive way, then I divide light from shadow and shade in all of the shadow parts, and then I break the shadows apart, cast shadow, reflected light, core shadows. But I don't draw that. That is how I highly recommend drawing when you're learning to draw. But I don't draw in that same rigorous way when I'm drawing for pleasure for myself. And I like to be able to go to the parts of the subject that I find beautiful or interesting. I like my attention to be caught by a detail and to follow that detail. And I will say that, during these drawing demos here, particularly as I'm answering student questions, I often default to more of that drawing for pleasure mentality, more so than the, I'm a teacher demonstrating a really rigorous approach to drawing. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that's not too revealing. But yeah, and I would say that's probably pretty typical among artists is that, like what we teach students to draw, how we teach students to draw and how we draw on our own, there's often a difference between those approaches. And again, it's not that we're being disingenuous, it's just that when you're learning to draw, it's important to have a process. It's important to have a set of reliable and practical and easy to understand rules that you can default to. But once you learn the rules, once you have these mental models well installed in your mind and in your muscle memory, then you can start to play with them a little more. You don't have to be so rigorous. And in fact, part of drawing in a creative way is learning how to intelligently break the rules, right? And so there becomes a lot more flexibility in terms of how you might approach a drawing subject than you may realize. So hopefully that kind of. Oh, go ahead.
I just think you could continue with this idea of breaking the rules. Yashvi asks, how do you find your personal drawing style?
Yeah, so I have a bit of a funny story about this. Really quick. These live drawing sessions are new, and we're trying to figure out what they're all about, how they work. And with an hour and a half in a live setting, I often like to take this opportunity to open up a lot more than I normally would in the course, and to give longer answers. But as we're refining this, if you ever feel like my answers are too long or not to the point, please let me know. This is ultimately for you, the students, to get something out of. So my hope is that you're finding this relatable and interesting in ways that you might, that you're not going to get it in a course where I'm much more structured. So here's my story about this. I was told by a drawing instructor who I loved and respected. He was a fantastic instructor, absolutely one of the best teachers I've ever had. But he had a rule when he drew. And he said, the word draw means to pull, right? Like a horse-drawn carriage, the horse that pulls a carriage. Drawing water from a well means pulling the water up from the well. So he said that when you're drawing is to pull. So you should always pull a line, never push a line. But as you'll notice, when I draw, I notice that the lines I found most beautiful and interesting, I push. So perhaps technically I'm not even drawing. I don't know what there's an opposite of the word to draw. This drawing is pulling. But so I found I really like lines when they're pushed. And so you'll notice nearly every contour I crafted in the drawing was pushed, not pulled. And that's, speaking of breaking the rules. And I had to work to get my drawing instructor to accept this. Like this became a huge part of my style. I really loved these calligraphic lines created by pushing the pencil versus pulling it. And so that was a big part. Also, calligraphic lines I'm a really big fan of. You'll note that I use a lot of different kinds of line qualities, and I love lines that kind of start hard and sharp and then open up to a much more, thicker and smokier approach. Also, I always like to say that my drawings are nowhere near as precise as they appear. A lot of my drawings, you see a lot of drawings behind me that they do appear very precise, but if you get up close, there's actually a lot of gesture and experimentation that's happening that's not always apparent at the outset. All right, so I'm working in the deeper parts of the shadows here. And I'm trying to capture a lot of this texture. And this is an interesting moment in a drawing because you'll see that I'm working on all these lines, all these textures, but in just a moment, a huge amount of this is going to get covered up with value. And so I want these lines to be just barely visible as they are in the reference photo. Because right now, you'll note that these lines are much more visible than they are in the reference photo. But now that I've got them worked out, I'm actually going to come back and I'm going to apply a much darker wash of value here that's going to start to obscure a lot of these lines. Also, we can see this sort of triangle of direct light right here. So I don't want to cover that up too much. So I'm going to darken around that.
So Britt, I wanted to share that Beth thanked you for the discussion about your moving around the drawing. And she said it was very helpful. She struggles with the structure of learning to draw. So having a little outlet to move around the drawing can be her little rebellion for now.
Yeah. Well, so here's a great way to think about this. I don't think necessarily strictly in terms of a drawing process. I have mental models, right? Mental models for light lines and basic shapes. I have a mental model for how light logic works. And as long as I am working within those mental models in a way that works, right? So I have a mental model of like, how light and shadow are used to describe form. I feel very comfortable shifting in and out of those mental models in a non-linear way, but returning to them. And they're all kind of running at once too. When you learn to draw, you have to learn everything separately, right? You learn the basic shapes of forms, right? And then you learn basic 3D forms, and then you learn light and shadow. And when you're learning to draw, you often then apply these methods in a linear way, right? Step by step by step. But I find that when I'm actually drawing, all of these programs are running at once. And so I can think about, the three-dimensionality of a form as I'm shading and, kind of craft the line quality as I go. We can think about all of these things at once. So you can start to layer them on top of one another. And when you start to do that, this more rigorous process starts to become a little less necessary. And another quick note here is that my thought is that, if you're looking for a really rigorous, structured form of drawing instruction, that's what the Drawing Lab courses are for. They're that really rigorous form of instruction. But here, I'm opening the process up. These are, I don't want to say casual, like, obviously I'm attempting to create beautiful and interesting drawings for you all, but they're not as rigorous. And as I said, during these live streams, I default to sort of my drawing for pleasure mode versus my much more rigorous academic approach to drawing. I just find spending this time with you all so pleasurable. So, any other questions or comments, Seraphe?
Sure. Since you've moved on to shading,
Yes.
So a student says, I struggle keeping my shading looking clean. The darks always seem to end up looking muddy and messy.
Okay.
She specifically says, how do you make your shading look so good? I guess
yeah. So I'll give you I'll give you a bit of an extended answer. So in my experience, messy shading that doesn't quite feel that feels messy or muddy. The problem actually starts with the reference, whether it's from life or from a reference photo. So what I mean by that is I work exclusively from subjects lit with a single light source. So with this subject that we're working with here, there was a single light. It was coming from the upper left in an otherwise dark room, right? There are no other light sources. And that's one of the only ways to get a full range of value, where we have, if you look at the reference photo, you can find your areas here, these beautiful highlights, right? Highlight here, highlight here, highlight here. We find a clear division of light and shadow, right? You can see that all of the shadows are on the lower parts of the forms or on the right parts of the forms, right? And so my first suggestion, or my first question is, are you drawing from subjects lit with a single light source? Because if you're not, well, then the lighting scenario is going to be chaotic to begin with. So nearly every reference photo that you're going to get from me, nearly every demo, I say nearly just because I can't think of one that hasn't been lit with a single source, but it's possible that I've at some point drawn something from an outdoor photograph that was in more like shade. But anyway, yeah, that's the way to get clear light and shadow. So that would be the first thing. Another thing I would recommend, that this dividing line between light and shadow, right? So this line of termination. Now, this is a complex subject. Do I have any less complex? So you can see, like can they see this sphere here? I think they can. But if you see on this sphere here, there's a clear line dividing light from shadow. Can they see that? I think so.
I'm not sure what you're asking if they can see.
Oh, I was pointing to something in my background.
Oh, okay. You're very small. Do you want me to make you larger so they can see that?
No, that's okay. Okay. But my point is that there's a clear division between light and shadow, and it happens in a line. So you'll notice that all of the shadow values are 3, 4, and 5 values only occur in those shadow areas. And in the lit areas of the subject, those are the only areas where we get the two brighter values, the 1 and 2 values. And so, yeah, just keeping that really clean and clear division between light and shadow is really critical. And again, like to practice this, the best bit of advice I can give you here is to, practice this doing really simple subjects like spheres and cylinders. That's where you'll learn how to divide light from shadow. And when you get to more complex forms like this, it'll be much more clear to you. Like, this form right here, well, this is essentially a cylinder, right? This part right here, like, if we kind of like cover this up, this is essentially an egg, right? So those kinds of distinctions become much more clear. So let me talk a little bit about light and shadow with this subject here. So up here, this is a really complex form, but if you look at the reference photo, if you ignore all of these little like striations going up and just think of this as one large form, once again, look, all of the shadow is on the lower right? And so I can even shade it in as a single simple form and then go back and break up that shadow into these kind of striations, right? And look, it's a perfectly simple and viable thing to do because, so we start off with that simple version of light and shadow before breaking it down into the more, complex version. But also every one of these little striations, the right side is darker, right? And the left side is a little brighter, right? So we can kind of keep that look and feel here. And we can work within that system. So again, here in this small form, we see the right side of this striation is in shadow, where the left side is lit. We go to the next one, the right side is in shadow, and the left side is lit, right? So we keep finding that same light and shadow pattern over and over again. So it's just thinking through these light and shadow patterns in that way. Hopefully that provided some clarity. So as with all of these, live demonstrations, my goal here is not to necessarily complete a drawing. I just want to spend some time drawing with you all, hopefully give you a sense of the process. All of these drawings take many hours to actually complete. But yeah, I'd like to get a start here. And, this kind of subject has so much detail in it. But so we have, 15, maybe 20 minutes left of this live demo here. So again, any additional questions you may have about drawing a subject like this, please send them. Or if there's something you want to see me handle in this live demo, please let me know. But I think the drawing is starting to work pretty well here.
So a question from Joshua, and he says he's going to bounce off the shadow questions. How should you approach texture, grain, color variations on the surfaces of objects without blending in with the shadow?
All right, so a couple of quick notes. So here, so obviously here we're dealing with an achromatic drawing, right? So I'm not shifting colors here. However, I am, I can deal with texture. So in a drawing like this, we do have highlights, right? So watch this. So I have these really dark shadow values, right? And I'm going to go back in and darken my shadow areas one more time, just to kind of really pull these shadows down before I start to add in some of the local value. But so yeah, so we want our darkest values to always be exclusively in the shadow areas. And this is a highly complex subject, everyone. So I don't want you to feel, particularly if you're new to drawing, this is a tough one because there are so many tiny details. Every single one of these little things is a little cylinder. We have all these bulbous forms. But my hope is that this gives you an idea of how you might approach a subject like this, even though, you may not feel ready to tackle a subject like this on your own at this level of detail. Okay, so I'm going to handle the local value first. So one thing you might be surprised at is at this point, of course, the whole subject is dark. So I'm going to put a light wash of value across the entire subject here. Now we are drawing on white paper, so of course the lightest value is going to be the white of the paper. And on a drawing like this, I actually really like to pull out my highlights rather than draw around them. A quick aside as well, one of the things that I do a lot in a drawing is, I don't try to nail the exact right values during my first passes. So if you were to do a time lapse of a drawing like this, what you would tend to see is the value, the drawing in its entirety getting darker and darker and darker over time. So in fact, all of the shadow areas here, later on at the end of this drawing, they would all be darker than they are now. So I very much look at the shading process as a process of layering. I'm not attempting to nail the exact value right off the bat. So that's a critical note here.
So Brent, I'm going to share some things unless you want to talk a bit before I share.
Oh, sure. I just wanted to say really quickly that now one of my favorite parts is pulling out highlights. So I've got myself a kneaded eraser here. I love kneaded erasers. I use them more than any other kind of erasers. If you're not familiar with kneaded erasers, they work like silly putty. So let me pull this back here. So they're not going to remove all value, But how they work is, once you kind of get it shaped, you want to get it warmed up in your hand by stretching it. But once you're ready, you take it and you can apply it to an area of value, rock it back and forth, and lift it, and you can see it starts to make that value brighter. And just like silly putty, you can actually see the lines that I drew right there. Once you have an area that has pigment on it, you just continue to pull it, and then you can, press it down, and you can remove more and more value. So you can see that area is now lightened. So again, it's not going to remove all value, but kneaded erasers are fantastic for pulling highlights out of organic forms like this. So I just laid down, a darker value across the entire subject, but now I can go back in and I can start to pull out the highlights. So I'm kind of creating a little shape here, and I'm using it almost like a little, almost like a stippling effect to pull out the brighter values. I'm going to do the same over here. And once I've, so these create really nice soft edged lit areas. And once I've lifted some of the pigment around the outer edges, then I can go in the center and lift out, a little more pigment. But I find that this creates really nice, kind of very organic looking, soft edged highlights. I think I may have forgotten my drafting brush today, so blow out some of that. Generally speaking, you don't want to move your hand over your drawing. That's a really good way to smear it. Oh, there's a drafting brush. Let me grab it. I thought I brought one in. It just wasn't right next to me. There we go. So you can see that starts to pull out some of the highlights, and I can, go back in and add some value around those areas. And again, I want to note, this is really a process of layering. As I work through a drawing like this, I tend to sneak up on the values. The darkest values come at the very end of the drawing. All right, so now in terms of texture. So we've got some really interesting textural areas. So let's focus on this area right here. So we've got these almost fibrous looking textures that are kind of going across. And so I'm kind of pushing and pulling the pencil back and forth to create some interesting kind of fibrous textures here. We have something similar over here. So I just kind of use, this is a little intuitive in terms of approaching texture. But yeah, so I'm kind of finding these sort of fibrous lines that these longer lines that I'm using to fill in some of those areas. I think those are starting to work quite well, in terms of adding some texture here. Similarly, we have some of these really interesting kind of textural lines over here. So once again, I'm not drawing these slowly. These are happening rather quickly. A lot of dark value over here I can add in.
All right, Brent, I'll share that Julie noticed that the pushing and pulling of the pencil was really interesting to her when you kind of talked about that idea from your teacher. And she had always wondered if Brent was pushing the pencil for more energy in the line and pulling the pencil for more precision.
The pushing is definitely about energy for me. I do like that kind of like, yeah, that push does feel like a more energetic way to handle a line. I don't know that I would say the pulling is for more precision. I'll have to think about that because I mean a lot of it's for convenience, right? I think if you play guitar, you have the up pick and the down pick, and a lot of it's not because you're trying to get a specific sound necessarily. It's just if you're playing fast enough, the only way to do that is to up down up down up down. So there is kind of a back and forth that occurs. Um, yeah, I'll have to pay attention to some of the why. But yeah, I think the pull is just a natural result of having to bring the pencil back, and if I can make that functional and get some line or value out of it, then it's not just about pulling the pencil back to a starting position, but I can actually draw while I'm pulling it back as well. All right, we are pretty close to the end here. So are there any other questions, comments, requests?
Thunder River says, I'm currently taking the drawing laboratory, and it is by far the best drawing course for beginners. Any recommendation on what I should learn next if my goal is to draw realistic portraits and animals?
So once you're done with the drawing lab, I would recommend going into the art and science of figure drawing. The figure when so another great old quote is that if you can draw the figure, you can draw anything. So when you learn drawing fundamentals, like in the drawing lab, you're going to learn the fundamentals, right? Light, shadow, form, three-dimensionality, how to construct things out of basic shapes. But, of course, like with any subject, there's far more out there than what's just in the fundamentals, right? And so you want to start to go beyond those fundamentals. And when you learn figure drawing, you're introduced to additional concepts like gesture drawing, which is a very different approach than basic shapes. Gesture drawing is much more about, we might say, energy and direction, how to create a living quality. And all of those kinds of skills are going to translate directly into something like animal drawing, right? So if you can draw the figure, you'll be able to draw animals. It'll also introduce you to the idea of anatomy, right? In fact, a lot of my comfort of drawing these really kind of bulbous forms in a drawing like this really come down to my comfort with drawing anatomy. I have so much experience drawing human anatomy that, yeah, drawing these kinds of bulbous forms seem pretty second nature to me. So I would go into figure drawing, and once figure drawing will fill in the more complex and advanced subjects that you're not going to get from a drawing fundamentals course, and those skills will really give you everything you need to be able to draw anything, including animals. And portraiture is the last subject you should attempt to draw, is there is zero margin of error in portrait drawing. So when you learn human anatomy, all of that will apply directly to animal anatomy. In fact, one of the most fascinating things you learn in comparative anatomy is once you know the human anatomy, then regardless of whether you're drawing a bird or a horse, they're all variations, right? It's almost all the same bones with very few exceptions and very similar muscles. They're just different shapes, right? So so that's a great way to start to really hone different kinds of skills. Any additional questions, Sarah Faye?
Well, the last comment I had saved was from Mitchell, and he has been going through your book, The Art and Science of Drawing, and he finds your writing super easy to digest, and the book is a treasure trove of information. I guess there wasn't so much a question there.
Yeah, well, that's great to hear. At some point, I would love to do a video or a live session talking about writing. That this is a little off topic, but I write in order to figure out how to think about a subject. And I've actually done a huge amount of writing about drawing. And one of the reasons why I thought it made sense to write a book is because I do so much writing about drawing anyway. Why not publish those thoughts? And I find writing for me to be a way to see what's in my head, see how I'm thinking about a subject. And writing is a really critical way for me to solidify a drawing process in my own mind so I can use it and make it much more practical. So yeah, it was great to be able to write a book. I think that taking a course, seeing the hand move, seeing the video part of it is superior to reading a book. That being said, they're different media, and so I do think that getting it from both, being able to deal with the subject in terms of through something like a book, it's just a different way to approach it. And I think as many different ways as you can approach this material, as you can, there are benefits to all of it. And so it's just building a similar mental model in your mind in different ways. So I think that can be really beneficial, particularly for beginners. Yeah, so I really love writing, and writing through the drawing process is a great way to solidify it in your mind in a different way. Yeah, right through, what do you do first? What do you do second? What do you do third? What's important to you with your drawing process? So, all right. Well, it seems like we are wrapping up here. Again, a drawing like this could go on for, at least another hour, but probably closer to 2 or 3 hours more, to really pull a drawing like this into, to really bring it to some sense of completion. But hopefully this, gives you some sense of how to approach a subject like this. As always, I'm so thrilled that you're here. I love sharing drawing with as many people as I can. It's such a wonderful way to connect with the physical world. So thank you so much for joining us here. Again, this is not a finished drawing, far from it, but hopefully this does give you, a sense of what the drawing process can look like when applied to a complex subject like this. So hopefully you'll be able to work and finish yours from the reference photo. Sarah Faye, do you have any additional comments or anything you'd like to wrap up with here?
I just wanted to thank people for their great comments and questions in the chat, and to remind everyone that we'll be back with the Creativity Lab Live on October 22nd, and that will be about collage or creativity through collage. So same time, but on October 22nd. And then our next Drawing Lab Live, so traditional drawing, will be on drawing the moon, and that will be November 5th. Do you want to give people a sneak peek on either of those, Brent?
Sure. Yeah. So as a drawing instructor, one of the things I'm realizing more and more is that being creative, increasing your creative capacity, is like a missing drawing skill. We spend so much time with the technical parts of the drawing process, we often forget to approach the creative side. And remember, when you draw, technical skills are great. Technical skills are important, but it's what you do with those skills that really turns a drawing or any sort of product into a creative work. And so in my experience, so many students spend hours and hours and years practicing the technical skills, but they often neglect the creative side. So I wanted to create this Creative Lab Live experience to delve deep into the creative process so we can talk about not just technical skills, but what to do with those skills, how to increase your creativity, what kinds of projects you can do. And just as this kind of traditional technical observational drawing is a great way to connect with the physical world around you, the creative process of drawing is a really profound way to explore internally, to delve into meaning, myth, metaphor, all of the things that make these technical skills come alive. So if you haven't yet attended a Creative Lab Live, come try it out. It's definitely an experiment, but I think students are getting a lot out of it. I'd love to hear in the comments really quickly as we're wrapping up. I'm curious how many people here are also coming to the Creative Lab Lives and what you think about those. And while those answers are coming in, I will talk a little bit about Drawn to the Moon. So yeah, so the next Drawing Lab Live, where we do talk about the technical skills, is going to focus on the moon. And this is going to be based in a new, again, it's a bit of an experiment, but what I'm very excited about, I'm creating a lunar drawing experience. It's a 30-day lunar drawing challenge that's going to be released as a course. It's in its final stages right now, and it's all about drawing the moon, getting outside and drawing the moon from observation as well as from photo reference. And we're going to delve into all kinds of creative ways of dealing with the moon as well. So I'm very excited about this process. It's been a really profound experience to create that experience, that course for you all. And yeah, and so it's going to be the focus of our next traditional live stream. So Sarah Faye, if you want to go over those dates again, so when the next Creative Lab Live is, and then when the next Drawing Lab Live is, that would be great.
Sure. So we are ideally back on our intended schedule, which is that we're alternating every other week with a Drawing Lab Live or a Creative Lab Live. So this week we had a Drawing Lab Live, so we won't be here next week. And the following week will be a Creative Lab Live. So that's October 22nd, and that's creativity through collage. And then 2 weeks later, which is November 5th, will be the next Drawing Lab Live, Draw the Moon. And you can click notify me on YouTube so that you get a little email when we go live on YouTube. You can also make sure you're on the newsletter so that you get the email reminder that the live stream is coming up.
Yeah, and do we get any sense of if there are students who are attending both the Drawing Lab Lives and the Creative Lab Lives?
So most folks have talked about the Drawing Lab Lives, but Julie did share that although she really loves the Drawing Lab Live, but the Creative Lab Live really expands her experience, and she's thankful for them. And so for her, interspersing or alternating between the two is really helpful.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. It is absolutely a pleasure and an honor to spend this time with you. And I know you could be doing other things right now. So, being here and drawing with me is really wonderful. So thank you so much. And as always, please let me know how I can make these more valuable for you as students. This is all about sharing my love of drawing with you and to get as many people drawing as I can. Also, feel free to, tell people about this. Remember, you don't need to be an artist to attend these. Drawing is not just about creating finished products. Drawing is about experiencing the world more deeply. And this is such a great way to be able to do that. When we look at an object like a seed pod, it's so to get a vague sense and move on. But when we draw it, we really get to immerse ourselves in the object in a profound way, where we really get to connect with it and take in its beauty and its visual interest and profundity and complexity in a way that we cannot get by looking alone. So that's what drawing is all about. So if you want to share this with friends, not with people you think might want to draw, but with people who want to experience life more deeply, those are the kinds of people that I think would really be interested in drawing. This isn't about talent, it's not about skill, it is about experiencing the world in a more deep and profound way. So thank you so much for being here, and we will hopefully see you on the next Creative Lab Live.
Thanks again,
Thank you so
everyone.
much.
Bye-bye.